Chapter 6, Part 3. So in this section, we are going to be looking at the major findings from behavioral genetic research. In the last video, we talked about behavioral genetic methods, how we do research in behavioral genetics. And in this video, we're going to be talking about the major findings from that research. We're going to talk about shared versus non-shared environmental influences, genotype environment interactions and correlations, and a little bit here at the bottom, molecular genetics, and all of this around values. Okay, so what have we found in the research? The most commonly studied areas of personality, the traits that are studied, is extroversion and neuroticism. Big study involving almost 5,000 pairs of twins. They found a substantial heritability for both of these traits. So extroversion, they found 0.51 for monozygotic and 0.21 for dizygotic. For neuroticism, they found 0.50 for monozygotic and 0.23 for dizygotic. So what does that tell you? Hopefully, you answered. This shows that there is a strong genetic component. Okay, because if they have this rate of 0.51 for mono, they share the same genes, 100% of the same. And they have 0.21 for dizygotic. Oops. Sorry about that. That shows that there's a, strong genetic component. Same for neuroticism, 0.50 when they share 100% of the same genes, and 0.23 when they don't. They share 50%. This heritability factor, don't worry, it's a little confusing when you first read it. Heritability factor, there's a formula there, double the difference between the two correlations, yada yada. I do not expect you to know how to calculate the heritability factor. What they're doing is just summarizing the findings from here to say that overall there's a heritability factor of 0.60 for extroversion. And for neuroticism, there's a 0.54 for neuroticism. Another research piece they mention in the text there, 253,000 individuals, they found heritability of neuroticism for 0.47. So there's a lot of research on that. That's fairly substantiated. Other personality traits, shyness, right? So when you take a look at shyness in that section, when they're talking about shyness, they're not saying shyness itself is genetic. They're saying that there's physiological roots to do with like hormones and neurotransmitters or whatnot, that the behavioral manifestation is shyness, right? So shyness is 0.44. Activity level, very consistent across time at 0.40. They use the actimeter to measure that in one of the studies, and they found that motor energy is pretty stable over time. So someone who is very high in activity level when they're young tends to be that way throughout life. Psychopathic personality traits such as dominance, aggression, tend to have moderate to high heritability. And then finally, with chimpanzees. Now this part was interesting because they're looking at, well, the finding basically that well-being and dominance in chimpanzees has heritability factors as well, demonstrates that genes influencing personality is not exclusive to humans. It is also found in non-human primates. And then here at the bottom, other personalities. So extroversion, we talked about that. Agreeableness, conscientiousness, the heritability rate of 0.50, 50%. Sexual orientation. This is an area that is highly controversial right now. They're saying sexual orientation tends to be stable over time and associated with important life outcomes like social groups, leisure activities, lifestyle. So the question is sexual orientation, is it genetic, right? So there are some studies, they discuss, Bailey et al., 1993, kind of old now, Twin studies of gay men and women, results showed 0.3 to 0.7 heritability, which is a huge range. Other research showed 0.3 to 0.7 heritability. So it's inconsistent, it's hotly debated. There are so many different pieces that go with this. Current evidence suggests that genes provide a modest and indirect influence via childhood gender nonconformity on sexual orientation. So there's 1,000 moving parts to this. So they are doing research. They do not have an answer. And so they state a very safe bottom line is sexual orientation may be partly heritable. So doesn't say too much. Not yet. Anyways. Second part, attitudes and preferences. So attitude is somewhat of a personality trait, okay? It's demonstrates a personality trait, which we're going to get to here. So attitudes and preferences, they tend to be stable over time and sometimes linked with actual behavior, right? So your attitude does sort of direct your behavior. Minnesota Twin Studies found that traditionalism shows a high heritability rate of about 0.60, which is quite high. So they're looking at traditionalism, which means favoring conservative values. Another study they mentioned is the Colorado Adoption Project. They had 654 participants, and they found a significant influence on conservative attitudes as early as 12 years old. So the attitude of conservatism or traditionalism is somewhat heritable. Another section they looked at was occupational preference. Ellis and Bonin, take a look at that study there. They looked at the preference. So they had 14 items, and they measured youth on those items. And the items all had to do with preferences for your work. What type of work would you like to do? What kind of activities would you like or would you prefer to be doing? And then they compared those to their parents. So for the genetic children, they found a 71% correlated significantly with their parent scores. Adopted children, only 3% correlated with their parents. So that sort of implies that it's more genetic, right? And not so environmental. If it was environmental, then the adopted children would correlate higher with their parents, adoptive parents. Other areas they talk about, they've done research with is beliefs in God, religious beliefs, religious attitudes. Low to no heritability there. And they're not really sure why some attitudes appear to be heritable and others not. They're probably interacting with personality traits of some kind. Anyways, research continues on there. Oops. Drinking and smoking. Now you can imagine drinking and smoking. They are manifestations of behaviors. So what would have people drink? And some people drink and smoke more than others. Well, what they have found is that people with personality traits such as sensation-seeking, extroversion, and neuroticism. Sensation-seeking and extroversion, out looking for excitement, always wanting to raise that bar, tend to be more involved with drinking and smoking. Also, people with neuroticism, anxious, frustrated, emotional, tend to be more involved with drinking and smoking. Drinking alcohol and smoking cigarettes stable over time. They both show evidence of moderate heritability, which is 0.36 to 0.56, which is fairly strong. Of course, alcoholism all shows a greater than 50%. We do know that is has a strong genetic component. They've also found in one study where the genetic component was found to be slightly stronger in men, 0.71 in men, 0.67 in women. They also found a genetic link between alcoholism and conduct disorder. So their suggested genes for both tend to be found in the same individuals. So those who tend to score high with alcoholism and conduct disorder They tend to be grouped together, is what I'm saying. Okay? Marriage. This is an interesting one. How can marriage be genetic? Well, part of being in a marriage is you have to want to marry, you have to be, say, the type to marry, you have to have maybe certain personality traits that enable you to stay married, right? So what does the research say? Genes can have influence on the propensity to marry or stay single. Heritability estimate for propensity to marry is 68%. That is high. Likely due to personality traits. So this part's interesting. So they found that men who are greater on social potency and achievement, same traits that are highly valued by women seeking marriage partners, tend to get married. So basically, men who marry tend to have increased amounts of traits desired by potential marriage partners. Right? Boosie's evolutionary psychologist. Right? So social potency, achievement, successful, has money, has resources, things that apparently women want to marry. Men have those. The men who get married. Marital satisfaction. Individual differences in women's marital satisfaction are 50% heritable. What they found was women's personality characteristics. So women who have dispositional optimism, warmth, low aggressiveness, they accounted for both women and men's marital satisfaction. So when women had those, everybody's happy. Husbands' personality did not explain either of their marital satisfaction. So they're not finding anything to do with men's personality traits to do with satisfaction. So the result, genes play a role in who gets married, who is satisfied in their marriages, and who gets divorced. Okay, so we are at shared versus non-shared environmental influences. This part's interesting. It makes sense, right? It totally makes sense. The same studies that suggest a moderate genetic heritability also provide evidence of the importance of environmental influences. Okay, so a personality characteristic shows heritabilities in the 40 to 60% range. So if we're saying 40 to 60% is genetic, well, then we're also saying up to 60% is environment, right? So it's also showing evidence for the environment. So if we're going to look at the environment, we've got to look at two parts. When you're doing family studies or twin studies, there's two types of environmental influences. There's shared influences and there's non-shared. I'll go into it more in this next section here. So features of shared by siblings. So think back to when you're growing up, living in the same house with your siblings. Okay, there's certain experiences that you share with your siblings and there's certain experiences that you do not share. For example, you have the same environment, you have the same books, we have the same computer, we have the same TV, we eat the same food. All of these things are shared. But there's non-shared environment. So parents may treat people differently, right? Different friends, different leisure activities. So think about how you and your siblings were maybe treated differently. So say my mom used to treat my older sister, she was the more responsible one. She had to take care of things. She was responsible for making food, making dinners, keeping us in line, and she was also more of the book smart person, right? Whereas I was more social, I was more involved in sports. I had very different friend groups than my sister had, and I was involved in very different things. So the environment has a major influence, but this influence is primarily in the form of non-shared variables. So when they're looking at family research or twins, they're not so much looking at the shared experiences, they're going to be looking at the non-shared. We do not know which non-shared experiences have key impact on personality. We do know unique environment experienced by each sibling carries the causal weight. So we're looking for, in your family, how are you treated differently, or how is your experience different from your sibling? So that is the environmental influence that would be of interest. Okay, next section, genotype environment interaction and the correlation. Okay. This is sort of tied to the shared versus non-shared. So differential response of individuals with different genotypes to the same environment. Sounds complicated, totally not. For example, task performance of introverts versus extroverts in a loud versus noisy, loud noisy condition versus quiet. So individual differences interact with the environment to affect performance. So you can have the same genotype, different environment, and have different responses, right? So if I'm an extrovert and you're an introvert and we're in the exact same environment, like a noisy room, we're going to react very differently to the same environment. So that is how the genotype and the environment interact. Other example, abusive parenting. And then so they have children that were raised with abusive parents or in that sort of environment. Children who had the genotype to produce low levels of, let's just say, MAOA. And there were children that did not have these high levels. They were raised in the same environment, but because of this difference, some developed conduct disorder, the ones that had low, and the ones that had high levels did not. So again, same environment, exposure to the same environment produces different effects on personality depending on the differences in the genotype. Genotype environment correlation. Differential exposure of individuals with different genotypes to different environments. That sounds complicated again, and it is not. So, for example, child with high apparent verbal ability exposed to more books by parents. It's sort of a natural thing that might happen in a family, right? So if one child tends to be, their parents perceive that they have a higher verbal ability, they may buy them more books, do more reading with them. The other child tends to be outside playing with balls and doing more sports. So they buy them more sports related toys and entertainment, and maybe they're out throwing the ball with that child and reading books with the other. So you're treating them differently because of how you're perceiving them. So you're strengthening some because of your perception. So genotype environment correlations can be positive. So you're encouraging the expression of those things, or they can be negative and discouraging the expression of those behaviors. So 3 types of this occurrence. Okay, there's passive. So the parents provide books so the parents are very, very high verbal. So they just provide all sorts of books. So the children have access to these books. They did nothing to get them. It's because the parents are high verbal. Reactive, parent reacting differently based on the child's genotype. So maybe one of the kids is very, very affectionate and the other one's a little bit aloof and kind of likes to be by themselves. So therefore, the parent is hugging one a lot more than the other, simply because they're perceiving that the hugging child wants to be hugged and the other one wants space, so they don't. So you're reacting differently based on their genotype, their disposition. And then finally, active. When a person with a specific type of genotype seeks out or creates a particular environment. So someone who is high in sensation seeking is seeking out excitement. They're wanting to go to sports or go skiing or water skiing or anything that's exciting. Intellectuals, they're seeking out conferences and museums. They want to read books. So active genotype environment correlation means you are actively seeking it out because of your genotype. Okay, in the final part, we'll talk about molecular genetics and then behavioral genetics and values. It will be a short video, but we're at 21 minutes now, so we're going to break off here. I'll see you in the next video.